October 12, 1492. A date written in history books, remembered in calendars, praised by some and condemned by others. But whatever your view of Christopher Columbus may be, one fact remains undeniable: that day marked the beginning of something enormous, a permanent collision between two worlds that had evolved completely apart for thousands of years. Before that morning, the people of Europe had only vague ideas about what lay beyond the Atlantic Ocean. Stories of monsters, edges of the earth, and golden cities were all they had. The Americas, meanwhile, thrived in their own rhythms. Powerful empires, rich cultures, deep spiritual traditions, they all existed without any idea that ships from a far-off continent were about to arrive on their shores. Then, in the early light of that October morning, a lookout from one of the 3 Spanish ships, the Pinta, shouted a single word that would change the world forever: tierra. Land. The sailors rushed to the deck. Some wept. Others dropped to their knees in prayer. After more than 2 months adrift in the unknown, haunted by fears of falling off the edge of the world, they had finally reached solid ground. But what they stepped into wasn't Asia, as they believed. It wasn't the land of silk and spices. It was something they could never have imagined, a continent untouched by European hands, minds, or weapons. They didn't know it yet, but they were standing on the edge of a new era, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. This moment wasn't just the discovery of a new world. It was the beginning of conquest, colonization, cultural annihilation, and, at the same time, a massive transformation of global trade, science, politics, and civilization as a whole. So what really happened on that first day? What did Columbus see? What did the native people feel? And why did this quiet tropical island, so peaceful at first glance, become the epicenter of one of the most significant turning points in human history? In this series, we'll explore the first day Columbus spent in what he believed was the edge of Asia. We'll go beyond the myths and dive into the historical records, personal journals, and first-hand accounts of the crew who landed that day. We'll paint the world as it was before this encounter and show how a single step onto an unfamiliar beach would ripple through centuries of history. But first, let's go back. Not just to that morning. Let's rewind to what led to this moment. Because to understand the first day Columbus spent in America, you have to understand why he sailed west in the first place. Stick with us, and if you're fascinated by history, untold stories, and the raw truth behind the legends, don't forget to subscribe. This is only the beginning. Before we talk about the man who changed history, we need to strip away the textbook version, the sanitized paragraphs, the marble statues, and the elementary school legends. To truly understand that first day on American soil, we need to understand the man who led the voyage there. Christopher Columbus was not some godlike explorer born with destiny in his hands. He was a complex, stubborn, brilliant, and deeply flawed man, and in many ways, an outsider in his own world. Columbus was born in 1451 in Genoa, a city in what is now modern-day Italy. His real name? Cristoforo Colombo in Italian, or Cristobal Colon in Spanish. He wasn't royalty, he wasn't rich, and he didn't have access to elite education. His father was a wool weaver, and like many in his class, Columbus started working early. He was exposed to the sea not through noble patronage, but through labor and trade. From a young age, Columbus was obsessed with maps, books about geography, and tales of exploration. But he didn't read them in the way you or I would. Columbus read with a mission. He was fascinated by the idea that there had to be a better way to get to Asia, a faster way, a route west across the ocean. While most seafarers hugged the coastlines and sailed around Africa to reach India and China, Columbus was convinced that sailing west would take him to the same destination. It wasn't just a hunch. Columbus blended actual geography with guesswork, scripture, medieval myths, and flawed mathematics. He underestimated the size of the earth and didn't know the Americas existed. But to him, his logic made perfect sense. Now, let's pause here. Because this is crucial, Columbus was not the only person who believed the world was round. That's one of the biggest myths out there. Educated Europeans in the 15th century already knew the earth was a sphere. What they disagreed on was the size of it and how long it would take to cross the uncharted Atlantic. Columbus insisted it was possible, and not just possible, but practical and profitable. He believed he could reach Asia in a matter of weeks. Most scholars, sailors, and royal advisors thought he was mad. If the earth were as big as they believed, his crew would starve or die of thirst long before finding land. So, for years, Columbus wandered from court to court trying to find a patron. He pitched his idea to the kings of Portugal, England, and even France, and he was rejected over and over again. He was poor, unfamous, and considered more of a dreamer than a leader. But he didn't give up. Columbus had something most others didn't: relentless belief. He had the kind of confidence that borders on delusion, the kind that both makes history and destroys lives. Eventually, after years of lobbying, he found a lifeline: Spain. More specifically, the Catholic monarchs, Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon. They had just completed the Reconquista, the brutal centuries-long campaign to expel Muslim rule from the Iberian Peninsula. They were flush with power, newly united, and eager to expand their empire. Columbus made them a promise: fund my voyage and I'll bring you riches beyond imagination. Gold, spices, silk, and most importantly, a shortcut to Asia that would make Spain a global trading power overnight. Still, even the Spanish court hesitated. It took multiple tries, intense lobbying, and finally the support of a few key figures, including some high-ranking priests and political allies, before the monarchs gave in. They signed the capitulations of Santa Fe in April 1492. It was a shocking deal for a man of Columbus's status. He would get the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, become governor of any lands he discovered, and receive 10% of the wealth from those lands. For someone with no noble blood, this was unheard of. But it wasn't just about money. For Isabella and Ferdinand, Columbus's journey was also a religious mission. They saw it as a way to spread Christianity to the far corners of the world and bring glory to Catholic Spain. This wasn't just a business venture. It was a holy conquest wrapped in exploration. So Columbus was finally given 3 ships: the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. They weren't massive warships or floating fortresses, they were merchant vessels retrofitted for a voyage that most considered suicidal. The crew? Many were convicts, debtors, or poor men looking for a second chance. They were promised royal pardons and riches if the journey succeeded. But deep down, most feared they would never return. And so, in August 1492, Columbus, the stubborn dreamer from Genoa, set sail west into the unknown. He wasn't a hero to his men. He wasn't trusted by the scholars. But he was now backed by the might of Spain, and every day that passed at sea brought him one step closer to rewriting the world map forever. Next, we look at the world he left behind and the state of Europe just before the age of exploration truly exploded. To understand what pushed Columbus to sail west, and what made monarchs like Isabella and Ferdinand take a chance on him, we need to look at the world as it was in the 15th century. Not just maps and borders, but mindset. Europe at that time wasn't just curious. It was hungry, desperate, competitive, and on the brink of transformation. This was an age defined by tension between old ways and new possibilities. Let's start with the basics. Europe, especially Western Europe, was recovering from centuries of internal strife. The Black Death had wiped out nearly a third of the population in the 14th century. Feudalism, the rigid, hierarchical system that had dominated society for centuries, was cracking. Trade was rising, cities were growing, and a new middle class of merchants and thinkers was emerging. But it wasn't just about economics. This was also the beginning of what we now call the Renaissance, a revival of art, science, humanism, and classical knowledge. Suddenly, Europe was full of questions. How does the world work? What lies beyond the oceans? Could man reach the ends of the earth and return alive? Books and maps were changing hands faster than ever thanks to the printing press, invented in the mid-1400s. Knowledge that was once trapped in monasteries was now spreading to merchants, explorers, and scholars. People were starting to think big, not just about their towns or kingdoms, but about the planet itself. At the same time, power struggles were shaping the geopolitical landscape. Spain had just unified under Ferdinand and Isabella. Portugal was already becoming a maritime powerhouse. France and England were still recovering from their 100 Years' War. The Ottoman Empire had taken Constantinople in 1453, cutting off many of Europe's overland trade routes to Asia. That single event forced European powers to rethink how to reach the riches of the East. And here's where the desperation really kicked in. Spices. Today, it's hard to imagine building an empire over nutmeg or cinnamon. But in the 15th century, spices weren't luxuries, they were necessities. Pepper preserved meat. Clove, nutmeg, and cinnamon were used as medicine, in cooking, and even in religious rituals. Controlling the spice trade meant wealth, power, and leverage. For centuries, these spices came from Asia, India, China, the Spice Islands, and traveled through the Middle East, often taxed and marked up heavily by Arab and Ottoman middlemen. European kingdoms wanted a direct route. No more middlemen, no more paying the enemy. Portugal, under Prince Henry the Navigator, had already begun sailing around the coast of Africa in search of that route. They were slowly working their way down the continent, setting up trading posts, mapping as they went. It was a methodical, deliberate strategy, and one that eventually led to Vasco da Gama's voyage to India in 1498. But Columbus had a different idea. Why not sail west? He believed, wrongly but persuasively, that Asia lay just a few weeks west across the Atlantic. He argued that the Earth was smaller than everyone thought and that the distance was manageable. While most educated people believed the Earth was round, they also believed it was too vast to cross without dying first. Still, the idea of a shortcut was too tempting to ignore. And there was another force at play: religion. Europe in the 15th century was still deeply shaped by Christianity. The Crusades had ended, but the desire to spread the Christian faith hadn't. The fall of Constantinople had been a psychological blow to Christian Europe. Spain, fresh off its victory in the Reconquista, was eager to expand Catholicism to the ends of the earth. For Isabella and Ferdinand, funding Columbus wasn't just a gamble on trade. It was a holy mission. If he succeeded, Spain wouldn't just grow rich. It would spread Christianity to new lands, new souls. This was empire building wrapped in divine purpose. Columbus promised both wealth and conversion. So, when he sailed in 1492, he was carrying more than charts and provisions. He carried the ambitions of a continent, its greed, its fears, its hope, its faith. Europe was no longer satisfied with borders. It wanted oceans. It wanted new lands to name, new people to rule, new gods to replace. What Columbus didn't know was that he was about to stumble into an entirely different world. A world that didn't know or care about Europe, its maps, or its holy wars. A world with its own civilizations, languages, and histories. A world that had evolved on a separate timeline for thousands of years. But for Europe, what mattered most wasn't what already existed. What mattered was what could be claimed. And soon, very soon, they would claim everything. In the next part, we'll explore how Columbus prepared for his journey, the ships, the supplies, the men, and the immense risk of sailing into the unknown. Once Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand gave their final blessing in April 1492, things moved fast. Columbus had spent years pitching his dream, facing rejection after rejection. But now, with Spanish funding secured and royal titles promised, he had a green light and not much time. He had to assemble a fleet. He had to recruit a crew. He had to prepare for a voyage unlike anything attempted before. And he had to do it without modern navigation, weather forecasts, or any guarantee there was even land to be found. Columbus was no admiral in the traditional sense. He wasn't commanding an army of trained professionals. His expedition was put together with urgency and filled with risk. The ships. The Spanish crown provided Columbus with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. They weren't large by today's standards, not even by the standards of the time. They were merchant vessels, not warships. Built for Mediterranean trade, not open ocean exploration. The Nina, real name Santa Clara, was a caravel, small, fast, and ideal for coastal sailing. It had a single deck and could be handled with a relatively small crew. The Pinta, also a caravel, was slightly larger and faster than the Nina. It was chosen for its speed, and it would be the ship that actually first spotted land. The Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship, was now a heavier, broader vessel used for cargo. It had more space, but it was slower and less maneuverable. Contrary to popular belief, these ships were not brand new or specially built for Columbus. They were leased, modified, and repurposed quickly for the voyage. The Santa Maria, for instance, wasn't even ideal for ocean travel. It would eventually run aground on the very first island they landed on. Each ship was equipped with basic navigation tools, compasses, hourglasses, quadrants, and rudimentary charts. There were no precise maps of the Atlantic. Much of what Columbus used was based on assumptions, guesses, and calculations from outdated sources. The total crew across all 3 ships was about 90 men, a mix of sailors, carpenters, cooks, servants, and interpreters. Many were from the port city of Palos, where the journey began. Some volunteered. Others were pressured into joining. A few were even criminals who'd been offered pardons in exchange for joining the risky expedition. They weren't explorers in the romantic sense. They were ordinary men chasing promises of gold, titles, and glory. They left behind families, farms, and whatever stability they had, setting out for something entirely unknown. Discipline was strict. Columbus was given near-absolute authority over the mission. Any act of disobedience could be punished severely, including by death. He kept 2 logs, one with actual distances traveled and another with shorter distances. He showed the crew a psychological trick to keep them from panicking as the journey dragged on. Among the most important crew members were the Pinzon brothers, Martin and Vicente. These were experienced sailors who captained the Pinta and Nina, respectively. Their local influence and reputation in Palos helped Columbus recruit men. Without them, the voyage may never have gotten off the ground. With limited cargo space, Columbus had to be strategic. The ships were stocked with hardtack, a dry, dense bread that could last months, salted meat, mostly pork and fish, olive oil, wine, and dried legumes. Fresh water stored in wooden barrels quickly became stagnant. Weapons and armor, crossbows, swords, gunpowder. Religious items, crosses, rosaries, and a copy of the Bible. Trade goods like glass beads, bells, colored cloth, and trinkets, not for currency, but to impress or pacify whatever people they encountered. There were no medical supplies as we'd recognize them today. Illness, injury, or infection often meant death. Sanitation was non-existent. Rats, spoiled food, and contaminated water were inevitable. And they knew it. Columbus also brought a translator, someone who spoke Arabic, under the assumption that if they did reach Asia, Arabic might help communicate with local traders or officials. It reveals just how completely wrong his assumptions were about what lay to the west. This wasn't just bold. It was borderline suicidal. Columbus was sailing into what many believed to be an empty, endless ocean. There were fears of sea monsters, whirlpools, or simply sailing off the edge of the earth. Even if they didn't fall off the world, the risk of starvation, dehydration, mutiny, or shipwreck was very real. Navigation was primitive. Weather was unpredictable. And once they left the Canary Islands, the last known outpost, they were truly alone. There were no rescue ships, no support, no backup plans. If they failed, they would vanish. No one would know why or where. But to Columbus, it wasn't failure he feared, it was obscurity. This voyage was his moment, his shot at history, his chance to rise above his station and etch his name into legend. And so, on August 3, 1492, the 3 ships left Palos de la Frontera, heading southwest toward the Canary Islands. From there, they would point west and disappear into the great unknown. In the next part, we'll follow them into the deep Atlantic. The weeks at sea, the fear, the tension, and the slow, creeping realization that maybe, just maybe, the Earth was larger than Columbus had ever imagined. When Columbus and his fleet finally set off across the Atlantic, leaving the last familiar outpost of the Canary Islands behind, there was a feeling among the crew that they were slipping into a void. For most of them, the open ocean was an alien expanse. There were no landmarks, no ports, no maps that could guide them. They were sailing into a world where no one they knew had ever returned from. For Columbus, this was the moment everything hinged on. Years of rejection and ridicule, of stubborn obsession and relentless persuasion, now it was real. The horizon was wide open, and the success or failure of his theory would be played out in real time. From the start, the voyage tested both the ships and the men. The Atlantic is not a gentle ocean. Winds howled, swells lifted and dropped the vessels violently, and the daily uncertainty wore down nerves. The men had signed on for a risky mission, but few were prepared for the psychological strain of endless sea with no sight of land, no escape, and no evidence they were going anywhere other than into oblivion. Columbus maintained tight control over the crew, keeping a second, falsified log to make the distance traveled seem shorter than it really was. He knew that if the men realized how far they'd gone and how long they'd been without land, panic and mutiny could follow. Every day, he logged the real distance in his private journal and a more comforting figure in the one he shared with the crew. This manipulation bought him time, but it didn't silence doubts. By mid-September, whispers of fear were spreading. Men began talking in hushed tones about turning back. Some feared they'd crossed into cursed waters. Others believed they'd soon run out of food or water. The lack of any land in sight day after day broke spirits slowly. Columbus tried to keep morale up with confidence, calculated optimism, and promises of imminent landfall. He'd point to clouds on the horizon, driftwood floating by, or the flight paths of birds as signs they were near land. Sometimes it worked. Other times it only fed their paranoia. There were moments when the mission came dangerously close to falling apart. On several occasions, the crew discussed seizing the ships and forcing a return to Spain. Columbus was not universally admired. To some, he was an arrogant foreigner, an Italian sailing under a Spanish flag, full of wild ideas and delusions of grandeur. But he held authority from the monarchs, and more importantly, he had the conviction of someone who truly believed he was on the brink of a discovery that would change everything. That conviction, irrational as it sometimes seemed, helped hold the mission together. He played on their fears, but he also played on their greed. He reminded them of the rewards that would await: riches, lands, pardons, fame. It was enough to keep them moving forward. Nature occasionally offered small glimmers of hope. They saw flocks of birds overhead which usually don't fly far from land, and pieces of vegetation in the water that seemed fresh. Each time, the sailors believed they were close, only to find nothing but horizon the next morning. Hope became a dangerous drug. It gave them strength, but also made the waiting more brutal. By early October, desperation had started to set in. The voyage had lasted longer than expected, and rations were starting to grow stale and thin. The men were on edge. Arguments broke out. Some had lost all faith in Columbus and feared he would drive them to their deaths rather than admit failure. Then, suddenly, everything changed. On October 6th, the crew spotted what they believed were birds flying westward, a sign stronger than any they had seen before. 2 days later, more signs appeared. The men began to take hope again. Then, on the night of October 11th, a sailor aboard the Pinta, Rodrigo de Triana, shouted what would become one of the most famous words in human history: tierra, land. In that moment, everything shifted. The despair, the tension, the creeping madness, it all gave way to euphoria. Men cried. Some fell to their knees in prayer. Others embraced or shouted toward the sky. They had made it. They had found what they thought was Asia. Columbus, who had promised land all along, saw this as the ultimate vindication. His vision had triumphed. His critics were silenced. But what they saw in the distance wasn't the edge of India or China or Japan. It wasn't the gateway to the Silk Road or the riches of the Orient. What lay ahead was something no European had seen before. A shoreline untouched by their world, inhabited by people with no knowledge of Spain, of Christ, of steel, or of gunpowder. A world with its own history, culture, and beliefs. A world that would never be the same again. And for Columbus, it was only the beginning. In the next section, we'll witness the moment of landfall, the first steps Columbus took on this new soil, and the first impressions of the land, the people, and the silence before history exploded. In the early morning light of October 12, 1492, the long and punishing wait was finally over. After more than 2 months at sea, the crew of the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria could see it clearly: land, real land, not a cloud bank or a false hope. What they saw was lush, green, flat terrain. Palm trees. A coastline gently curving under the sunrise. For some, it looked like paradise. For others, it was simply relief. But none of them, not even Columbus, understood that they were not in Asia. They had found something else entirely. The 3 ships anchored offshore, just beyond the reach of the coral reefs. Columbus, dressed in his most formal clothes, prepared to come ashore. He carried the royal banner of Spain and a journal where he would record everything. Several armed men joined him in the rowboat. This wasn't just a ceremonial landing, it was a claim. The Spanish crown had financed this journey, and Columbus had orders to take possession of any new lands he found. So when he stepped onto that beach, he wasn't just touching new soil. He was, in his mind, planting an empire. What we now know is that Columbus landed on an island in the present-day Bahamas. He called it San Salvador. The exact location of the original landing is still debated by historians, but the act itself is unquestioned. This was the first recorded moment when Europeans arrived in the Americas and made contact with the land and its people. Columbus knelt and gave thanks to God. He took out his banner and declared the island property of the Spanish crown. For the men around him, it was a mix of spiritual triumph and geopolitical strategy. To them, this was both divine reward and legal conquest. But they were not alone on this island. Watching from the trees, from a distance, were the first indigenous people to lay eyes on these strange visitors from across the sea. Columbus later wrote in his journal that they came forward cautiously, naked, curious, peaceful. They brought gifts: parrots, cotton, small trinkets. The sailors, by contrast, offered them beads, bells, and glass. It was a surreal moment of exchange, 2 completely separate worlds attempting to understand each other with no shared language, no shared history, no shared concept of what was about to begin. Columbus wrote that the natives, he called them indios, believing he was in the East Indies, were generous and friendly. He noted how they had no iron or steel, no weapons of war, and seemed to live simple, open lives. He also noted how easily they could be converted to Christianity and how, in his words, they would make good servants. That single sentence reveals everything. In Columbus's mind, this was not just a new land. These were new people he believed could be molded, used, repurposed under European rule. His journal, though filled with admiration for the landscape and the beauty of the islands, quickly shifted toward conquest. He looked for signs of gold. He asked the natives if they knew where gold could be found. Every gesture of friendliness was interpreted as permission. Every gift was seen as tribute. Every act of peace was treated as submission. Still, the first day was calm. No blood was spilled. There was awe, confusion, curiosity. The sailors wandered the beach, exploring the forests and shoreline. They collected samples of plants and animals. They marveled at the birds, the fish, the sheer brightness of the environment compared to the gray tones of Europe. It was lush, vibrant, alive. And for the crew, it seemed like success beyond imagination. But even then, there were signs of trouble ahead. Communication was impossible beyond gestures. Misunderstandings were common. When Columbus asked about gold and the locals didn't respond with what he wanted to hear, he grew frustrated. He assumed they were hiding information. He didn't understand that their cultures didn't measure wealth in coins or jewelry. They had no idea what Europe wanted, and Europe had no intention of asking twice. Still, there was no violence on that first day. The initial encounter was peaceful, even reverent. Columbus treated it as a sacred event, and the men around him followed suit. For now, they had done the impossible. They had crossed an ocean. They had found land. And they had lived to tell the tale. Back on the ships, they celebrated. Food was shared, prayers were said, and men who had feared they'd die at sea now toasted to their fortunes. Columbus, ever aware of legacy, wrote carefully in his journal. He knew these words would be read by kings and queens, by scholars and priests. He painted the moment as both a spiritual discovery and a fulfillment of his promise. But beneath the surface of his writing, the gears of colonization were already turning. This island, this moment, this peaceful shore, it would not remain untouched. It was now on a collision course with empire. The people who had lived there for generations had no idea that the world was about to collapse in around them. And the men who had just stepped off the boats had no idea what they had truly found. In the next part, we'll explore that first encounter in more detail, who the native people were, how they lived before that moment, and how they experienced the arrival of the Europeans from their own perspective. For all the words written by Columbus, all the logs and letters sent back to Spain, there's one perspective that remains mostly silent in the historical record: the voices of the people who were already there. The ones who watched strange ships appear on the horizon. The ones who saw pale-skinned men step onto their beach wearing iron, waving flags, and speaking a language no one understood. These were the Taino, the indigenous people of the island Columbus would call San Salvador. Their world didn't begin with his arrival. It was already old, already rich, already full of stories, gods, customs, agriculture, astronomy, and art. The Taino were part of a larger Arawakan-speaking network that stretched across the Caribbean and into parts of South America. On the island Columbus landed, they lived in small, organized communities. Their homes were made of wood and thatch arranged in circles. They fished, farmed cassava and sweet potatoes, harvested fruits, and lived in balance with their environment. They had chiefs called caciques, and their societies were built on cooperation, not conquest. Warfare, while present in the region, was not the center of their identity. Spiritual life was vital. They believed in spirits called zimis, which inhabited natural objects like rocks and trees. Their rituals involved music, dance, and ceremonial cohoba, a hallucinogenic snuff used by shamans to communicate with the spirit world. They had never seen iron, never heard a gunshot, never met anyone from beyond their waters. When Columbus arrived, they didn't attack. They didn't run. They approached with caution, yes, but also with curiosity. Columbus noted in his journal how the natives swam out to the ships, how they offered parrots and cotton, and how they smiled and gestured. To the Taino, these strangers were mysterious but not immediately threatening. They had no context to interpret what this moment would mean. They didn't know this was an invasion. They couldn't imagine what was coming. To Columbus and his men, however, this meeting wasn't innocent. It was opportunity. The lack of clothing, the lack of weapons, the open hospitality, these were all interpreted as signs of weakness. The Europeans saw no armor, no fortresses, no resistance. They assumed superiority from the very first interaction. When the Taino gave gifts, the Spaniards believed they were submitting. When they smiled, the Spaniards thought they were grateful. Every gesture of peace was taken as permission to dominate. Language was a wall they could not cross. There were no interpreters, no Rosetta Stone. All communication happened through pantomime, guessing, repetition. Columbus tried to ask about gold using hand gestures and showing small trinkets. The Taino pointed inland, possibly misunderstanding the question entirely. They didn't value gold as currency. It was used as ornament, if at all. The obsession Columbus had with gold would only deepen from this moment on. Even in this peaceful exchange, something was already shifting. Columbus wrote in his journal how easily the Taino could be converted to Christianity. He praised their physical appearance, called them handsome and strong, and then immediately reduced them to resources. They would make good servants, he wrote again. He planned to take some of them back to Spain, not as ambassadors, but as living proof of his discovery and tools of propaganda. That first day, 6 Taino were taken aboard the ships. Whether they went willingly is unknown. What is known is that they would never see their home again. For the Taino, this wasn't a moment of loss yet. They didn't see the danger. There was no fight, no violence, no open hostility. But underneath the surface, the arrival of the Spaniards had already changed their fate. Diseases they carried, smallpox, influenza, measles, would eventually sweep through the islands, decimating communities. The seeds of conquest were planted on that first beach. The notion that the land could be claimed by a foreign king, that people could be converted, used, replaced, it was all there in Columbus's notes. But on that day, there was still a kind of surreal calm. The two groups watched each other with intense interest. The Spaniards marveled at the flora, the fauna, the weather, the lack of European diseases and hierarchies. The Taino marveled at the strange objects the strangers brought. Steel blades that could cut through wood, glass beads that caught the sunlight, clothes made from unfamiliar fabrics. And towering above it all, the ships, monstrous, floating beasts that defied the sea. Neither side truly understood what they were looking at. Neither side knew how short the peace would last. But that silence, that meeting, that hour on the beach, it would echo through centuries. It would become the line in the sand between one age and another, between the old world and the new. In the next part, we'll turn to Columbus's own writings from that very day. His journal, his thoughts, his intentions, and how the words he put on paper would set in motion the machine of empire. The events of October 12, 1492 might have faded into mystery if not for one detail: Columbus kept a journal. Not just a casual log of dates and winds, but a carefully written narrative, part travel log, part manifesto. This journal, or at least the reconstructed version we have today, offers one of the only first-hand accounts of that day. And it reveals just how quickly exploration turned into domination. The original journal was presented to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand after Columbus's return, and although the original has been lost, a copy was made under the supervision of Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest and later one of the fiercest critics of the colonization that followed. Thanks to that version, we can read what Columbus wrote in his own words, sometimes raw, sometimes calculated, always revealing. He began with praise for the island's beauty. He described it as lush, fertile, filled with birdsong and bright skies. The water was clear, the breeze was gentle, and the air smelled of flowers and trees unknown in Europe. It was, in many ways, paradise. But quickly, his attention shifted to the people. Over and over, he mentioned their generosity, their physical appearance, their lack of weapons. He noted that they carried no iron, wore no armor, had no understanding of the tools the Spaniards brought. This wasn't just curiosity. It was evaluation. Columbus's journal repeatedly fixated on the potential of the natives to become Christians. He saw them not as equal participants in a meeting of civilizations, but as souls waiting to be claimed, pliable, simple, and useful. He wrote that they seemed to have no religion and believed they could easily be taught the Christian faith. To him, that wasn't a cultural exchange, it was an obligation and a right. If they could be taught, they could be controlled. The journal entries make it clear that Columbus was already thinking in terms of conquest. He didn't see the land as simply discovered. He saw it as taken, claimed. He described planting flags, reciting declarations in the name of the Catholic monarchs, and formally annexing the island, even though no one who lived there understood the language or concepts he was using. The legal theater of possession was performed as if the Taino weren't standing there at all. When Columbus wrote about the possibility of gold, his tone shifted. He asked the islanders where he might find it, and when they pointed toward other islands, he immediately set his sights on further exploration. Every direction the natives indicated became a clue. Every gesture fed his obsession. The search for gold would become the engine of the entire voyage. It was the one thing that could validate the journey in the eyes of the Spanish crown. Finding land was remarkable, but finding wealth was necessary. He also described the physical strength and appearance of the locals, their tall stature, straight bodies, and well-formed features. But even these compliments were paired with the idea that they lacked understanding. They were, in Columbus's view, blank slates to be written on by Europe. This was not admiration. It was the start of objectification, of control. One of the most telling lines in his journal is simple, almost clinical: "They should make good servants." That sentence would echo for generations. In it, we see the seed of the transatlantic slave trade, of forced conversions, of plantations, of the systematic reduction of human beings into tools of empire. He wrote it on the same day he marveled at the landscape. On the same day he gave thanks to God. In Columbus's mind, there was no contradiction. This was discovery. This was destiny. It's easy to imagine that the first day was pure wonder, pure awe. And to some degree it was. For the sailors who had feared they would die in the vast Atlantic, the sight of land, the warmth of the island, and the initial kindness of the Taino must have felt like salvation. But for Columbus, that all was filtered through ambition. Every sight was an opportunity. Every native a potential convert, a laborer, or a guide to treasure. He didn't write about partnership. He wrote about possession. Even the way he recorded direction reveals his mindset. He mapped the island as if it were already his. He charted harbors, noted sailing conditions, evaluated possible places for fortresses. There was no question in his writing about whether they had a right to be there. The assumption of European superiority was absolute, unspoken, and total. His language was measured, often respectful, and sometimes poetic. But beneath that surface was the steady rhythm of empire, expansion, exploitation, control. What makes the journal so important is not just what it records, but how it frames the encounter. This was not an equal meeting. It was a declaration. A narrative written by the side with the pen, the language, and the military force. It's worth noting that this journal would be read not only by monarchs but by explorers, priests, and colonists in the years that followed. It shaped how the Americas were viewed. It became part of the myth of the New World, a place of innocence and opportunity waiting to be civilized. The idea that the people living there were passive, grateful, or even lucky to be discovered, that began here in these pages. But we know what followed. Within decades, millions of indigenous lives would be lost to disease, violence, slavery, and the dismantling of entire cultures. The journal doesn't mention that, of course. On that first day, the tone is calm, controlled, even optimistic. But in hindsight, every line carries weight. Every word leads forward, not just into the jungle, but into history. In the next part, we'll look at the religious motivations behind the voyage, the idea that this was more than exploration, more than profit. This was a mission of faith, one that would be used to justify everything that came after. While gold and glory often steal the spotlight in stories of Columbus's voyage, they weren't the only forces at play. Beneath the economic ambition and personal ambition ran another powerful current: religion. For Columbus, for his royal patrons, and for much of Catholic Europe, exploration was not just a political or financial project. It was a divine mission, one ordained by heaven, sanctioned by scripture, and draped in the authority of the church. And that belief didn't just shape the voyage, it justified everything that followed. By the late 15th century, Catholicism wasn't just a religion. It was the organizing force of life in Spain. The monarchy and the church were bound together in purpose and politics. Spain had just emerged from the Reconquista, the centuries-long effort to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. In 1492, the very same year Columbus set sail, Spain had conquered Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Europe. That was no coincidence. In the eyes of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, the purification of Spain through the expulsion of Jews and Muslims was just the beginning. Now, they turned their eyes outward to lands beyond Europe, to souls yet to be reached by the Christian cross. Columbus understood this perfectly. In his appeals to the Spanish monarchs, he didn't just promise riches. He promised the opportunity to spread the Christian faith to new worlds. He described unknown peoples who, in his view, had no religion, or at least none that mattered to the church. He offered the crown a holy conquest, a way to expand Christendom, not just the empire. That pitch resonated with Isabella in particular, a devout Catholic who viewed colonization as a religious duty as much as a state endeavor. When Columbus landed on the islands, he wasted no time invoking God. The journal entries from the first day are filled with thanks to the Creator. He knelt and prayed. He made the sign of the cross. He declared the land taken in the name of the Catholic monarchs, but also in the name of the Christian God. The symbolism was deliberate. This wasn't just a flag planted. It was a spiritual claim. Columbus repeatedly described the Taino as lacking any visible religion. To him, their nakedness, their openness, their lack of churches or priests meant they had no real belief system. Of course, this was a complete misunderstanding. The Taino had their own rich spiritual traditions, worshipping nature spirits, performing rituals, living with a sense of sacred balance. But because their religion didn't look like Catholicism, it was dismissed as ignorance or superstition. This idea that indigenous people had no valid religion would become a core justification for what came next. If they had no God, then Christianizing them was not just an option, it was a responsibility. If they lived in darkness, then Europeans were bringing them light. This paternalistic logic transformed colonization from conquest into what many saw as salvation. Columbus wasn't a theologian, but he was deeply religious. He believed he was part of a divine plan. He often wrote of signs, prophecies, and biblical parallels. Later in life, he would even suggest that his discoveries were fulfilling scripture. He viewed his mission as apocalyptic in the literal sense, part of the unfolding of God's design for the end times. To him, sailing west was not just a geographic act, but a spiritual one, a step toward the final unification of the world under Christ. For the monarchy, this religious motivation helped galvanize public support. Bringing the gospel to heathens was something the Spanish crown could proudly present to its people and to the Pope. Conversions weren't just religious victories. They were political tools. A newly baptized people could be more easily ruled. Their submission wasn't just to a king, but to a God, one who spoke Latin, built cathedrals, and offered salvation through obedience. That first day, Columbus spoke gently of the islanders, but he already imagined their spiritual transformation. He wrote how they would easily become Christians, how they were innocent and pure as if their souls were waiting to be claimed. He imagined churches rising where forests stood. He saw the cross above every village. He saw himself as the first light of a holy fire that would spread across this land. But what began as evangelism would soon turn into enforcement. Future expeditions would bring missionaries, yes, but they would also bring swords. Conversions would happen, but many would happen at the tip of a blade. Baptisms would come, often alongside slavery, disease, and destruction. The sacred and the violent became inseparable. The irony is that the Taino had not asked for any of this. They had their gods, their stories, their sacred spaces. They were not waiting for salvation. But in the eyes of their new visitors, they were incomplete. The beach where the cross was drawn in the sand became, in European minds, the first chapter in a holy narrative. In truth, it was the first chapter of cultural erasure. Columbus didn't see it that way. In his mind, he was doing God's work. He was discovering new lands, yes, but also new flocks. He believed what he was doing was righteous, blessed, eternal. That belief made him bold, but it also made him blind. In the next part, we'll examine the political significance of Columbus's landing, not just for Spain, but for the entire European power structure. Because in 1492, the world was watching and the race for empire was only just beginning. When Columbus set foot on that small island in the Caribbean and raised the royal flag of Spain, he wasn't just claiming territory. He was making a political statement. This was Spain's entry ticket into a global race for supremacy, a race that, up until that moment, Spain had been watching mostly from the sidelines. But after October 12, 1492, everything changed. In one symbolic act of planting a banner in unfamiliar sand, Spain had thrown itself into the center of a new world order. At the time of Columbus's voyage, Europe was fractured into kingdoms, empires, and rival city-states, each vying for trade routes, resources, and influence. Portugal had taken the lead in maritime exploration, sending expeditions down the coast of Africa and across the Indian Ocean. Their ships had mapped new territory, established outposts, and built a reputation as navigational masters. Spain, though powerful, was newly unified and still trying to catch up. The success of Columbus's voyage instantly elevated Spain's position, not just in the eyes of Europe, but in the eyes of the world. To the Catholic monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, Columbus's discovery was more than a moment of geographic luck. It was a national triumph. Spain had just completed the Reconquista and was emerging from centuries of internal struggle. Now, with one bold expedition, they had a chance to project their power far beyond the Iberian Peninsula. The lands Columbus claimed and all the lands he believed were waiting just beyond were seen as virgin territory, untouched and unclaimed, ready for the crown's symbol to be stamped across them. The news traveled quickly. When Columbus returned to Spain months later, he was paraded as a hero. His journal, his maps, and most importantly, the native people he had brought with him were presented as undeniable proof of a vast new frontier. The royal court received him with awe. A single voyage had delivered what countless campaigns had not, an entirely new world to claim, rule, and exploit. But Spain wasn't alone in its ambition. Other European powers, most notably Portugal, France, and England, were watching closely. Portugal had already secured papal backing for its exploration of Africa and trade routes to Asia. Now, with Spain entering the game, tensions quickly escalated. Who would control the new lands? Who would regulate the seas? Who would reap the benefits of this massive expansion? In response, the Spanish crown moved fast. They turned to the Pope, the ultimate spiritual and political authority in Catholic Europe, to legitimize their claims. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued a series of papal bulls known as the Interci Terra, which effectively granted Spain exclusive rights to any new lands discovered west of a certain meridian. The logic was simple. Since the mission was framed as a religious endeavor, the Church had the power to allocate these lands. This sparked immediate backlash, especially from Portugal. The result was the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, a diplomatic agreement between Spain and Portugal brokered to divide the non-European world between them. An invisible line was drawn down the globe, roughly 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Lands to the west would belong to Spain. Lands to the east would belong to Portugal. The fact that neither side truly knew how big the earth was or what lands even existed didn't seem to matter. The line was drawn, and with it, the first formal act of carving up the world by European empires. Columbus's voyage then didn't just mark the discovery of new territory. It marked the beginning of a new global order, one in which distant lands could be claimed with a signature and a seal. One in which entire civilizations could be absorbed into royal claims made thousands of miles away. For Spain, this was the beginning of empire. For the people who already lived in these lands, it was the beginning of being treated as subjects without sovereignty and resources without voice. Back in Europe, the response to Columbus's success was more than excitement. It was inspiration. Other explorers saw the fame he had gained and sought to follow in his wake. Governments realized the potential wealth waiting across the seas and began funding their own voyages. What had once been considered impossible was now a race for colonies, for gold, for souls, for power. The concept of discovery, as defined by European monarchies, had shifted. It was no longer about exploration in the spirit of curiosity. It was a political act, a declaration of intent, backed by military force and divine authority. Columbus had proved that vast territories, full of land, labor, and resources, were within reach. The scramble was on, and it would shape every major European power for the next 5 centuries. For Columbus personally, the initial success brought glory, titles, and immense status. He was named Admiral of the Ocean Sea, given the right to govern the lands he discovered, and promised a cut of the profits from future voyages. But even in that moment of triumph, rivalries were forming. Spanish nobles, jealous of his rapid rise, began whispering doubts. Some saw him as a foreigner playing king. Others saw danger in giving one man so much power over lands no one truly understood yet. His position was not as secure as it seemed. Still, on that first day and in the first weeks after, none of that mattered. To Spain, the voyage had delivered proof of divine favor. The crown had invested in a risky voyage, and it had paid off beyond imagination. Columbus's banner planted in Caribbean sand was a symbol, a signal, and a warning. Spain had arrived, and it had no plans to leave. In the next part, we'll explore just how far Columbus was from his original goal, and how a critical mistake about geography would shape the myths and misunderstandings that lasted for centuries. When Columbus set foot on that first island in the Caribbean, he believed he was standing somewhere off the coast of Asia. Not just vaguely the east, but near Japan, India, or China. He was convinced that the islands he had found were the outer edge of the Indies, and he clung to that belief for the rest of his life. This misunderstanding wasn't a minor navigational error. It was a fundamental misreading of the world's geography, one that shaped every interaction, every report, and every decision he made from the moment he landed. To understand how this mistake happened, we need to look at the state of geographical knowledge in late 15th century Europe. Most educated Europeans already knew the Earth was round. That myth that Columbus proved the Earth wasn't flat is false. What they didn't know was the true scale of the planet. Ancient estimates, especially those based on the work of Greek geographer Ptolemy, significantly underestimated the Earth's circumference. Columbus believed those numbers and even argued for an Earth smaller than Ptolemy's already flawed measurements. He calculated that a westward route from Europe to Asia would take just a few thousand nautical miles. In truth, the distance between Spain and East Asia across the Atlantic and Pacific is vast. What Columbus didn't know and couldn't have known was that two massive continents stood between him and his goal. The Americas weren't on any map he had. They weren't even in his imagination. So when he landed in the Bahamas, he immediately began interpreting what he saw through the lens of Asia. He assumed the islands were part of the East Indies, a chain of spice-rich islands that European traders dreamed of accessing. That's why he called the people he met Indios Indians. He believed they were inhabitants of some remote part of India or nearby territories. That name would stick inaccurately for centuries. Columbus asked the locals if they knew of a place called Sapanga, the name Marco Polo had used for Japan. They didn't. He asked about the Great Khan, the ruler of China in Polo's tales. Again, there was no recognition. But instead of taking these as signs that he wasn't in Asia, Columbus doubled down. He assumed the locals were too far removed or too primitive to know what he was talking about. He believed he was on the outskirts of Asia, not near the great cities yet, but getting closer with every island. His descriptions in his journal reflect this belief. He noted how the people had no gold or silk, but reasoned that wealthier islands were surely nearby. Every interaction was shaped by the expectation that China or India must be just over the horizon. Even when his own crew started to question the assumption, Columbus remained committed. He had promised Asia to his sponsors. He had sailed with the goal of reaching Asia. And now, faced with unfamiliar land and people, he forced the facts to fit the story he had already written. This misidentification was not just a private error. It had global consequences. Reports sent back to Spain described these new territories as being part of the Indies. Maps began to show the Caribbean as the edge of Asia. Explorers who followed Columbus sailed with the same expectations. The entire framework of early European expansion in the Western Hemisphere was built on a lie that they were dealing with Asia when in fact they had stumbled upon something entirely different. And this lie was convenient. It allowed the Spanish crown to claim they had achieved their objective. It gave Columbus the credibility he needed to secure further voyages. It reassured investors, clergy, and nobles that their money had not been wasted. For years, the truth that they had found a new continent was suppressed, ignored, or simply not understood. It would take decades before Europe finally realized what had actually happened. Even after multiple voyages, Columbus refused to admit that he hadn't reached Asia. His fourth and final journey ended in failure and disillusionment, but he died still believing that he had discovered a shortcut to the east. Other explorers like Amerigo Vespucci eventually put the pieces together. They saw that these lands weren't extensions of Asia, they were something new. A new world. And in time, cartographers began to reflect that. The name America would eventually be applied to these continents, honoring Vespucci's recognition rather than Columbus's denial. But by then, the term Indians was already cemented. The misunderstanding had become institutional. It appeared in official documents, in colonial law, in church missions. The people of the Americas would carry that misnomer for centuries, a label born from a navigational error imposed by men who had never imagined a continent so large and so different could exist. Columbus's stubbornness, in many ways, was his greatest strength and greatest flaw. It carried him across the ocean when others wouldn't try. It sustained him in the face of doubt and failure. But it also blinded him to the truth of what he had found. He didn't discover Asia. He didn't even understand the scale of his mistake. But in trying to reach one world, he had collided with another. And that collision, even if misunderstood, would reshape human history. In the next part, we'll shift focus from Columbus himself and look more closely at how the Taino people lived before contact, their culture, structure, values, and what exactly was lost when that first step onto their island was taken. Before the sails appeared on the horizon. Before the sound of foreign voices. Before steel, gunpowder, and foreign flags touched their shores, the Taino lived in a world of rhythm, balance, and deep connection to the land. The first day of European arrival was, for them, the last day of a world untouched by outside hands. And to understand the full weight of what happened in 1492, we need to understand what existed before it. The Taino weren't scattered tribes or wandering groups. They were an organized, deeply rooted people who had shaped the Caribbean for generations. They were the dominant culture in the Greater Antilles, occupying what is now Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. Their society wasn't just stable. It was thriving. They lived in planned villages called ukieks, arranged around central plazas. At the head of each community was a cacique or chief, a leader chosen not only for power but for wisdom, diplomacy, and lineage. These chiefs were both political leaders and spiritual guides, often advised by elders and bohiques, priests and healers. Inheritance of leadership often passed through the female line, a reminder that Taino culture placed great importance on matrilineal bonds and the role of women in preserving tradition. Their homes, called bohayos, were made from wood and palm leaves, round, practical structures designed to withstand the Caribbean climate. Families lived in extended units. Children were raised by entire communities. Elders were honored, not ignored. The Taino economy was agricultural and cooperative. They cultivated cassava, their staple crop, using a sophisticated technique that allowed them to feed large populations. They grew maize, beans, sweet potatoes, peppers, peanuts, pineapples, and tobacco. They fished using hand-woven nets and bone-tipped spears. They navigated in carved canoes, some large enough to carry up to 100 people. There was no private land ownership as Europeans understood it. Land was a shared resource maintained by communities, not ruled by individuals. They were also accomplished artisans. They made pottery, wove cotton, carved wood and stone, and crafted ceremonial objects with astonishing intricacy. Their jewelry included bones, shells, feathers, and gold, which they called guanan. Unlike Europeans, the Taino didn't treat gold as currency or a symbol of power. It held spiritual value but not economic one. And that misunderstanding, one of many, would prove catastrophic. Spiritually, the Taino believed in a universe filled with unseen forces. Their gods, or zimis, were represented in carved idols and stone figures. These zimis were not just deities, they were ancestral spirits, guardians of health, fertility, crops, and nature. Rituals were held to honor them, involving song, dance, drumming, and cohoba, a hallucinogenic snuff used by shamans to communicate with the spirit world. These ceremonies were sacred, central to their worldview, and completely misinterpreted by the Europeans as primitive or demonic. Morality in Taino culture was based not on written law but communal ethics. Reciprocity, generosity, and respect were key values. Theft and violence were rare, not because of harsh punishment, but because of the strength of social cohesion. Hospitality wasn't just custom, it was a sacred duty. Visitors were fed, welcomed, protected, which is exactly how they treated Columbus and his crew. They extended kindness because in their world, kindness was strength. They had no reason to expect that kindness would be met with conquest. The Taino also had a rich oral tradition. Stories were passed down from elders, songs taught lessons, and myths explained the origins of the world. They believed their ancestors emerged from sacred caves. They traced the sun's journey, mapped the stars, and followed lunar cycles. Their calendars were aligned with planting seasons, harvests, and rituals. This was not an undeveloped people. This was a culture with thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, tailored not for industrialization, but for survival, community, and harmony with the land. Even their warfare was structured and limited. They had enemies, including the more aggressive Carib groups from the Lesser Antilles, but combat was ritualized, not genocidal. Captives might be adopted or ransomed, not exterminated. Victory wasn't measured in annihilation, but in prestige. And then came the ships. Columbus saw nakedness and assumed primitiveness. He saw lack of metal tools and assumed ignorance. He saw peacefulness and assumed weakness. But what he failed to see, and what much of Europe refused to see, was the depth, dignity, and complexity of the people standing before them. In a single generation, much of this world would be broken. Not just physically, but spiritually. Languages would vanish. Rituals would be outlawed. Oral histories would be silenced. And a culture that had once shaped the islands would be reduced in European writings to a footnote. But that first day, before enslavement, before epidemics, before forced conversions, the Taino stood as they had always stood, proud, organized, and alive in their own world, a world that would soon be taken from them in the name of kings, gods, and gold. In the next part, we return to the Spanish point of view and follow the first attempts to explore more of the islands, searching for riches, answers, and ways to turn discovery into dominion. The first day on land had been calm, even peaceful, but that peace was never meant to last. For Columbus, the discovery of San Salvador was not the end of the journey, it was the beginning of something far bigger. He believed he had found the gateway to Asia, and if this was just the edge, then surely greater riches lay nearby. Gold, spices, silks, cities, All the things he had promised the crown, all the things the expedition was expected to deliver, still had to be found. And so, after a brief stay on the first island, Columbus turned his sights outward. The days that followed were marked by constant movement. The three ships began charting nearby islands, hopping from one landmass to another in search of more promising territory. Each time they anchored, the pattern repeated itself. Columbus went ashore with a small party, claimed the land for Spain, exchanged gifts with the locals, and asked about gold. The Taino, who continued to greet the visitors with kindness and caution, pointed inland or toward other islands. Whether they understood what the Spaniards were asking for or simply wanted them to leave is still unclear. But every vague gesture was taken as a lead, every answer a clue. Columbus noted in his journal that the natives wore small bits of gold jewelry, nose rings, earrings, beads. When asked where they came from, the answer was often the same: another island. That word, another, became a driving force. The obsession grew. The ships pressed forward, moving deeper into what we now call the Bahamas and eventually reaching the larger island of Cuba. Columbus believed Cuba might be the Chinese mainland. He sent scouts inland, searching for cities, for palaces, for evidence of wealth and civilization that matched the accounts of Marco Polo. What they found were more villages, more humble communities, more peaceful people. No cities, no armies, no marketplaces. The dissonance between what Columbus expected and what he encountered was growing. But instead of questioning his assumptions, he revised the evidence. He convinced himself that the great cities must be further inland or further west. The puzzle would always be solved on the next island. The next major landfall was Hispaniola, today divided into Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Here, Columbus finally believed he had found something worthy of the crown's interest. The island was larger, the interior mountainous, the rivers fresh, and the land full of promise. He wrote of fertile valleys, gentle breezes, and an abundance of natural resources. He also encountered more gold, still in small quantities, but enough to ignite his conviction that Hispaniola was the key. He chose it as the center of Spanish operations in the New World. It would later become ground zero for colonization in the Americas. As exploration expanded, so did the underlying motive: extraction. The Spanish weren't simply discovering, they were measuring. Every tree, every coastline, every gesture from the natives was interpreted through the lens of use. Could this land grow crops? Could it support settlers? Could the people be made to work? It was not enough to find. They had to calculate, and they had to profit. Columbus was already imagining ports, plantations, and forts. He spoke of bringing settlers. He considered how to divide the land. In his writing, you can see the mental shift taking place from explorer to administrator, from voyager to governor. The sailors, too, began to grow restless. Some had come for glory, but many had come for gold. They had survived a brutal ocean crossing, faced fear and starvation, and now they were told to wait, to scout, to build, to obey. Tensions grew, especially among the officers and crew. Columbus tried to manage these tensions by promising rewards to those who found signs of wealth. Every tiny nugget of gold, every rumor of a mine, became a catalyst for deeper, more aggressive incursions inland. But despite all the movement, all the notes and sketches and mapping, one thing was becoming increasingly clear: the riches Columbus had promised were not materializing. There were no great palaces, no rivers of gold, no kings, no armies, no spices, no silk. He had found land, yes. He had found people. But the fantasy of Asia was slipping further away with each island. Still, Columbus remained confident. Or at least he portrayed confidence. His writings were always composed with the crown in mind. He knew his sponsors wanted success. They wanted evidence that their investment would pay off. So Columbus carefully shaped the narrative, emphasizing the potential, downplaying the challenges, and always pointing toward the next horizon. If wealth hadn't been found yet, it was surely just out of reach. If these people weren't rich, perhaps others nearby were. The illusion had to be maintained. What was happening, without anyone quite realizing it yet, was a shift from contact to colonization. Columbus's mindset, and the mindset of those following in his wake, had already changed. This was no longer just about finding a route to Asia. It was about laying claim, about extracting resources, about turning new land into property and new people into labor. The seeds of empire were germinating with every step inland. And the Taino were watching. They watched as more and more strangers appeared, as their sacred spaces were entered, their rivers renamed, their chiefs questioned, their customs misunderstood. They watched as some of their people were taken aboard ships and not returned. As the Spaniards grew more demanding, less patient, more suspicious, what had started as curiosity was becoming concern, and for some, fear. In the next part, we'll explore how that fear turned into resistance, and how the first fractures in the peaceful contact began to show. In the earliest days following Columbus's arrival, the Taino people greeted the newcomers with hospitality. They offered food, guidance, gifts, and safe passage. This wasn't because they were naive or submissive. It was part of their worldview, hospitality as tradition, welcome as strength. But over time, that openness began to shift. What started as curiosity gradually gave way to caution, then concern, and eventually resistance. The strangers who once marveled at the land now demanded things from it. The men who once exchanged gifts now expected obedience. And the ships that once came with wonder now cast a growing shadow. At first, the Taino may have believed the Spaniards were spiritual beings. There are accounts, mostly from Spanish chroniclers, suggesting that some natives thought the Europeans were gods or messengers from the heavens. Whether this was sincere belief, mistranslation, or simply cautious flattery is uncertain. But that illusion didn't last long. The Spaniards bled when cut. They got sick. They quarreled. They demanded things without giving. The veil fell quickly, and what remained was harder to reconcile: a group of outsiders with strange tools, unpredictable behavior, and a relentless hunger for gold. Columbus's questions about gold became more persistent. His interest in native beliefs and culture faded. He wanted answers, and when he didn't get them, he interpreted the silence or confusion as defiance. This misunderstanding deepened the divide. The Taino didn't mine gold in the way Europeans imagined. What little gold they had was gathered from rivers and worn decoratively. It wasn't a currency. It wasn't power. But to Columbus and his men, gold was proof, the proof they needed to validate their journey, to satisfy the crown, to fuel the next phase of empire. Without it, their credibility and perhaps their lives were at stake. Tensions grew. Some Taino villages began limiting contact. Others moved deeper inland. Some chiefs became more guarded in their dealings with the Spaniards. The balance was shifting. What had once been a visit was beginning to feel like an occupation. Columbus noted these changes in his journal, but interpreted them as problems to be solved, not warnings to be heeded. And then came the first acts of force. As the Spaniards became more desperate for signs of wealth and control, they began seizing individuals for questioning, for translation, or simply as proof of power. Some were taken aboard ships to serve as guides. Others were brought back to the camps and kept as servants. These were not mass abductions, not yet, but they marked the turning point. The line between guest and invader had been crossed. To the Taino, the message was clear: these visitors did not intend to leave. There are accounts of early skirmishes, minor clashes between sailors and villagers over resources or misunderstandings. Most were quickly resolved, but each one eroded the fragile trust that had existed in the first days. Columbus tried to maintain control, but his authority over his own men was not absolute. Some of the crew acted on greed or impulse. Others began to see the natives not as hosts, but as obstacles. Tensions within the Spanish ranks mirrored tensions with the Taino. The longer they remained, the more volatile everything became. In one documented case, a small group of sailors attacked a local village, possibly in retaliation for a perceived insult or refusal to cooperate. The exact details are lost, but what matters is this: blood was shed. And when that happened, the idea of peaceful contact died with it. For the Taino, the signs were now impossible to ignore. The strangers took what they wanted. They spoke only to demand. They honored no traditions. They gave little and expected much. And worst of all, they did not go away. But resistance in these early moments wasn't war. It was withdrawal. It was silence. It was the closing of doors, the disappearance of guides, the refusal to answer questions. It was a shift in tone, not yet in battle. The Taino still hoped, perhaps, that the Spaniards would leave, that they had seen what they came to see and would return to their world. Columbus, meanwhile, wrote of these developments with growing frustration. He accused the islanders of hiding gold. He believed they were withholding secrets. His writings reveal a growing paranoia, the sense that he was surrounded by people who were no longer allies, but liars. And that paranoia would soon be used to justify harsher measures. The stage was being set. The masks had fallen. The first cracks in the illusion of peaceful discovery had formed. On one side, a people trying to protect their homes. On the other, men who believed they had a divine and royal right to take what they pleased. In the next part, we'll witness one of the most consequential events of the early expedition, the wreck of the Santa Maria, and how that accident led directly to the founding of the first European settlement in the Americas. By late December 1492, the expedition was deep into the island Columbus named Hispaniola. The initial awe of landfall had given way to urgency, the need to report back to Spain, to show evidence of success, and to secure Spanish presence before rivals followed. Then came the accident. On Christmas Eve, with waters calm and skies clear, the flagship of the expedition, the Santa Maria, ran aground on a reef near the northern coast of the island. It wasn't a storm or an attack. It was a tragic combination of fatigue, poor judgment, and bad luck. Columbus had gone below deck to rest, leaving control of the ship to an inexperienced sailor, a boy, by most accounts. In his absence, the ship drifted too close to shore. It struck coral, the hull cracked, and the vessel began taking on water. Despite frantic efforts, the Santa Maria couldn't be saved. It was a devastating blow. The ship was the largest of the three and served as Columbus's command center. Now it was wrecked, broken beyond repair. But what began as a disaster soon became a turning point, one Columbus seized as an opportunity. With the ship beyond saving, he ordered that it be dismantled. The wood and salvageable supplies would be used to construct a fort, a permanent outpost, the first of its kind in the New World. He called it La Navidad in honor of Christmas Day when the decision was made. The plan was simple: build a small settlement, leave a garrison of men behind, and return to Spain with the news of discovery, knowing there was now a Spanish foothold in the Americas. The construction of La Navidad was basic but symbolic. Using the wreckage of the Santa Maria, the men built a crude fort with walls, towers, and living quarters. It wasn't grand, but it represented something new, the shift from exploration to occupation. Spain now had its first colony in the Western Hemisphere. It would be guarded by a small force, 39 men hand-picked by Columbus to remain behind. These included sailors, carpenters, and soldiers, all sworn to defend the settlement, build relations with the natives, and continue the search for gold in Columbus's absence. Before departing, Columbus gave these men clear instructions. They were to respect the local Taino population, honor the authority of the local cacique, Guacanagari, and maintain peaceful relations. Guacanagari, who had offered help after the wreck and even sent villagers to assist in the salvage operation, seemed friendly or at least diplomatic. Columbus viewed him as a potential ally, someone who might serve Spanish interests and smooth the way for future colonization. But there was another layer. Columbus also believed La Navidad would serve as proof of Spanish power. The message was clear: this land was no longer just visited. It was now occupied. Even as he planned his return to Spain, Columbus was thinking in terms of permanence, of empire. He left the settlement stocked with weapons, provisions, and promise. In his mind, he was returning not from an expedition, but from the successful founding of Spain's overseas domain. Yet even as he sailed away, doubts lingered, not in his writing, which remained confident, but in the situation he left behind. The 39 men had no experience governing or navigating local politics. They didn't speak the language. They were isolated, outnumbered, and fueled by ambition. It would only take a few missteps, greed, disrespect, violence, to undo everything. From the perspective of the Taino, La Navidad was a troubling sign. Until that moment, the Spaniards had been travelers, visitors from another world. Now they were staying. They were building. They were arming themselves. And while Guacanagari may have welcomed Columbus, other chiefs on the island viewed the newcomers with suspicion. The Taino world was not a monolith, it was a network of alliances, rivalries, and local powers. The arrival of armed outsiders upset that balance. The wreck of the Santa Maria had unintended consequences. It anchored the Spanish presence to the land, forcing Columbus to act before he was ready. It committed him to something far beyond exploration, to administration, to diplomacy, to rule. And it turned a logistical failure into the foundation of a colonial blueprint that would spread across the hemisphere. When Columbus set sail back to Spain in early January 1493, aboard the Nina, he carried a powerful narrative: the voyage had succeeded, the land was rich, the people were gentle, and Spain now had its first outpost in a newly discovered world. But what he left behind was fragile. La Navidad stood not as a triumph, but as a test of whether European ambition could survive in a land it didn't understand, among people it had already begun to exploit. That test would soon fail. In the next part, we'll follow Columbus's return to Spain, how he was received, what he promised, and how the myth of discovery began to take hold back in Europe while trouble brewed silently in the shadow of La Navidad. As Columbus set sail from the shores of Hispaniola in early January 1493, he left behind a small settlement of men, a fractured alliance with local Taino leaders, and a coastline that now bore the Spanish flag. But his mind was fixed on what lay ahead, not more islands, but Europe. He knew the stakes. This wasn't just a return journey, it was a chance to shape the story before anyone else could tell it. What he wrote, what he said, and how he framed his expedition would determine whether his name became a footnote or a legend. The voyage home was anything but smooth. The Nina and the Pinta, the only two ships remaining, were battered by storms. At one point, Columbus feared they might not survive. He even sealed a summary of his discoveries in a barrel and threw it overboard, hoping it would eventually wash ashore and deliver his message if the sea claimed them. But luck held. After weeks of rough sailing, Columbus made landfall in Portugal, then traveled overland to Spain, arriving in March 1493 to a reception beyond anything he could have expected. Word of his return had already spread. Rumors of strange lands, gold, and new peoples traveled faster than the ships themselves. When Columbus entered Barcelona, he was treated like a hero. Royal courts greeted him with pomp and ceremony. He wore silk. He brought gifts, parrots, carved objects, cotton textiles, and most powerfully, several Taino individuals taken from the islands. They were put on display, symbols of Spanish triumph, silent proof of the lands he had found. Columbus presented his journal, his maps, and his interpretations of what he had seen. He spoke of fertile lands, gentle natives, and abundant resources. He promised that the islands were rich in potential, ready for Spanish settlement, trade, and Christian conversion. He carefully downplayed the hardships, exaggerated the wealth, and painted the future in bold, ambitious strokes. This was not deception in his eyes. It was strategy. He had seen enough to know the land had value, and now his task was to secure more voyages, more resources, and more authority to pursue it. The monarchs were delighted. Columbus was granted titles and privileges according to the original agreements: Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of the Indies, and the right to a percentage of the profits from all the lands he claimed. But more than that, he had delivered something intangible but powerful: momentum. Spain now had the upper hand in the race for global dominance. While Portugal had charted Africa's coasts, Spain had leapt across the sea and touched something entirely unknown. The reaction across Europe was electric. Scholars debated what Columbus had found. Was it truly Asia? Was it some unknown corner of the Indies? Had the world just gotten larger than anyone had imagined? The cartographers scrambled to update their maps. The theologians asked what role these new peoples played in God's plan. Merchants asked about spices. Monarchs asked how to get their own Columbus. Suddenly, the horizon no longer looked like a boundary. It looked like a door. The myth of Columbus, the brave, divinely guided discoverer, was born in this moment. Carefully curated letters describing the voyage were circulated widely. These were not dry reports. They were public relations documents designed to stir the imagination and encourage support for further colonization. They spoke of untapped wealth, of willing converts, of lands that seemed untouched and waiting for civilization. In reality, the islands were home to well-established societies. But in the European narrative, they were newly discovered, which meant they were available. Back on Hispaniola, however, the truth was already unraveling. La Navidad, the settlement built from the wreckage of the Santa Maria, had fallen silent. Reports would soon arrive that the garrison Columbus had left behind had not survived. According to Taino accounts and later Spanish reports, the men had broken Columbus's orders, abused the local population, fought among themselves, and provoked violence. Their actions had led to retaliation, and the settlement was destroyed. Columbus would not learn the full extent of this until his second voyage. But for now, that failure was still hidden beneath the glow of his return. What mattered most in that moment was perception. And perception was power. Columbus promised more voyages, more lands, and more conversions. He envisioned a vast network of colonies and trade routes, and he positioned himself at the center of it all. The monarchs agreed. A second expedition was authorized almost immediately, and this time it would be no small fleet. 17 ships, over 1,200 men, livestock, seeds, tools, priests, soldiers. This was no longer exploration. This was colonization. The door had opened and Spain was stepping through it with purpose. In the next part, we'll turn back to Hispaniola, to the ashes of La Navidad, and see how the second voyage, larger, louder, and more aggressive, changed everything for the land Columbus first called a new world. When Columbus set out on his second voyage in September 1493, everything was different. The first expedition had been small, desperate, uncertain, a gamble. The second was a campaign. 17 ships, over 1,000 men, horses, cannons, seeds, pigs, cows, supplies for settlement, missionaries, and weapons. This was no longer exploration. It was the machinery of empire in motion. Columbus had been elevated to the status of imperial pathfinder. The Spanish crown wasn't just sending him back to map islands. They were sending him to claim them, settle them, rule them. Spain was investing in a vision: permanent colonies, native labor, Christian conversions, economic return. Columbus, in turn, saw himself not just as admiral but as governor, and he intended to rule accordingly. The fleet crossed the Atlantic much faster than before. With experience and a larger support system, the journey was smoother, more coordinated. The morale was high. Most of the men on board had heard the stories of fertile islands, gentle natives, easy gold. Many came seeking fortune. Some came to escape. Others, like the priests, believed they were spreading salvation. Few understood what truly awaited them. When the ships reached Hispaniola in November 1493, Columbus's first order of business was to check on La Navidad, the small fort built from the wreckage of the Santa Maria, left under the care of 39 men. Columbus had imagined it would grow into a permanent Spanish outpost, a symbol of success. But as the ships approached the shoreline, something was wrong. The area was eerily quiet. No smoke, no sentries, no signal fires, no boats paddling out to greet them, only silence. When the landing party went ashore, they found what was left: ruins. La Navidad had been destroyed. The structures were burned, the Spanish weapons and supplies scattered or missing. The bodies of the men were nowhere to be seen. Perhaps buried, perhaps carried off. Eventually, Columbus pieced together the truth from Taino witnesses and survivors from nearby villages. The garrison had unraveled almost immediately after he sailed away. Without discipline, oversight, or respect for the locals, the Spanish settlers had descended into chaos. They had raided villages, stolen food, taken women, and fought among themselves. The warnings Columbus had issued about honoring local leadership and maintaining peace were ignored. The Taino, initially welcoming, eventually had enough. Whether through coordinated retaliation or opportunistic rebellion, La Navidad was attacked and wiped out. The settlement was gone. For Columbus, it was a humiliating revelation. The peaceful narrative he had delivered to Spain was shattered by the reality of colonial failure. But instead of seeing this as a warning, a chance to reassess, Columbus and many of his men saw it as provocation. The destruction of La Navidad wasn't treated as the consequence of Spanish abuse. It was framed as native treachery, and that shift in perception opened the door to violence on a scale the islands had never seen before. Columbus ordered a new settlement to be built, one better fortified, farther from the ruins of La Navidad, and more defensible. This would become La Isabela, the first true European city in the Americas. With it came a new approach: stricter control, heavier armament, and the beginnings of forced labor. Relations with the Taino were no longer based on mutual curiosity or diplomacy. Now it was about subjugation. Expeditions were sent inland, not just to explore, but to locate gold, enforce Spanish authority, and intimidate resistant chiefs. Some Taino leaders, still trying to preserve peace, cooperated or appeared to. Others resisted, organizing pockets of rebellion and refusal. In response, Columbus sanctioned punitive raids, public punishments, and military action. The Spaniards began taking captives. Taino men were seized and used as guides, porters, laborers. Women were taken for companionship or forced service. The line between diplomacy and domination was gone. The colonists, many of whom had come expecting riches and easy success, found themselves in a hostile environment they did not understand and could not control. Their frustration turned outward. The natives became both target and scapegoat. Columbus, struggling to maintain order among his own men, turned increasingly authoritarian. He implemented harsh discipline, built prisons, and relied more heavily on military enforcement. Complaints from settlers began to grow. Some accused him of mismanagement, cruelty, or favoritism. But his authority remained intact, backed by royal titles and a belief that any brutality was justified by the mission. What was once a journey of discovery had become a system of conquest. The destruction of La Navidad marked a psychological turning point. The illusion of gentle conversion and peaceful expansion was over. In its place came fear, suspicion, and the machinery of colonization. fortresses, forced labor, punishments, and extraction. And yet, amid all this, the Taino continued to resist. Some fled into the mountains. Others formed alliances with rival chiefs. Rebellion was not yet coordinated on a large scale, but the seeds had been planted. The people who had once greeted the strangers with food and song were now preparing for survival. In the next part, we'll examine how this resistance grew, how Taino leadership began to organize, and how the first native revolts against Spanish occupation would begin to challenge Columbus's authority and reshape the course of the colony. By the time La Isabela was under construction and the second voyage fully underway, the nature of Spanish presence in the Caribbean had changed. It was no longer exploratory. It was occupational. Columbus's initial instructions had been to convert the natives, establish peace, and find gold. But the failure of La Navidad and the aggressive push for resources and control had shattered any illusions of cooperation. For the Taino, the Spaniards were no longer guests, they were invaders. And as the reality of colonization settled in, resistance began to take shape. The early signs were subtle. Villagers withdrew from contact. Trade slowed. Information became scarce. When asked about gold, the answers grew vague. Some Taino chiefs refused to send emissaries to Spanish forts. Some warned others to avoid the newcomers altogether. It was resistance through absence, a refusal to cooperate. But the Spanish, interpreting this as defiance, responded with force. Expeditions were sent deeper inland with the aim of collecting tribute, asserting dominance, and securing native labor. These incursions pushed further into Taino territory, often without warning or negotiation. The violence escalated. The turning point came with the actions of one man, Cayanabo. Cayanabo was a powerful cacique who ruled over a large portion of the central region of Hispaniola. He was not only respected but feared. Unlike Guacanagari, who had initially cooperated with Columbus and even assisted after the Santa Maria's wreck, Cayanabo took a hard stance. He saw through the Spaniards' intentions early. To him, the destruction of the land, the taking of captives, the building of forts, these were not misunderstandings. They were declarations of war. According to Spanish accounts, it was Cayanabo who had led or sanctioned the attack that destroyed La Navidad. And while Columbus and his men called it betrayal, Cayanabo saw it as justice. When the Spanish began penetrating Cayanabo's territory, he responded with the first organized resistance. Not scattered violence, not reactionary defense, but coordinated, deliberate action. Columbus realized the threat and made Cayanabo a primary target. He sent his brother, Bartholomew Columbus, along with a brutal captain named Alonso de Ojeda, to capture him. The Spanish tricked Cayanabo into a meeting under the pretense of diplomacy. Once close, they subdued him and, according to legend, used polished iron manacles to deceive him into thinking the shackles were ornaments of power. Whether or not he believed it, Cayanabo was taken prisoner. His capture was a major propaganda victory for Columbus. It was presented to the Spanish crown as proof of control, authority, and divine favor. But the reality was far less stable. Cayanabo's seizure enraged his allies and unsettled the network of chiefs across Hispaniola. His brothers and fellow leaders began plotting retaliation. For the first time since the Spanish arrived, multiple Taino groups started working together toward a common goal, driving the invaders out. The first large-scale revolt occurred in 1495. It involved thousands of Taino warriors from several regions. They aimed to overwhelm the Spanish settlement at La Isabela and push the foreigners back into the sea. The Taino had numbers, knowledge of the terrain, and unity. But the Spaniards had steel, horses, and brutality. They also had something far more devastating: disease. Smallpox, influenza, and other European illnesses had begun to spread among native communities, weakening populations and sowing fear long before the first weapons were raised. In battle, the Spaniards used mounted cavalry, a terrifying sight to the Taino, who had never seen horses. To them, man and beast seemed like one creature. The psychological impact was enormous. Spanish swords cut through wooden clubs. Armor repelled arrows and stones. And worst of all, Columbus implemented a policy of terror. After crushing a segment of the revolt, he ordered mass mutilations. Captured warriors had their hands cut off, were sent back to their villages as warnings, or were simply executed en masse. The goal was to crush morale, to show that resistance would bring only suffering. But even with these atrocities, resistance didn't die. It went underground. Chiefs still held meetings in secret. Villages refused to send tribute. Informal alliances formed across great distances. Guerrilla tactics began to emerge: ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, sabotage. The Taino adapted quickly. They were no longer hoping the Spaniards would leave. They were preparing to survive them. Back in Spain, Columbus continued to report success. He downplayed the unrest, framed resistance as isolated, and emphasized how many natives had been baptized or pacified. But in reality, the colony was on the edge of chaos. The settlers were unhappy. The indigenous population was growing hostile. Gold was still scarce. And political enemies back in Europe were beginning to question Columbus's ability to govern. The resistance of the Taino, led first by Cayanabo and then by a growing movement of allied leaders, marked the beginning of indigenous opposition to European conquest in the Americas. It was not yet coordinated across islands, and it would ultimately be overwhelmed by the combination of Spanish firepower and epidemic disease. But it mattered. It challenged the Spanish myth of effortless domination. It reminded Europe that the so-called New World was not empty, not passive, not waiting to be taken. It had its own leaders, its own power, its own voice. And though the voice of the Taino would be silenced in the coming decades, their resistance planted the seed of defiance that would echo through every indigenous struggle that followed. In the next part, we'll step back from the immediate conflict and explore how Columbus's arrival and the first day that began it all reshaped the economic, political, and cultural systems of the entire world. October 12, 1492 was more than the date Columbus stepped onto Caribbean sand. It was a pivot point, one of the rare days in human history after which everything began to operate differently. What started as a voyage financed by a rising European power turned into the spark that ignited global transformation. The first day marked the beginning not only of conquest and colonization but of a new world system, one that would reorder trade, labor, belief, and power across the planet. Before that day, the continents of the Eastern and Western hemispheres had developed almost entirely in isolation. Civilizations in Europe, Africa, and Asia had traded, warred, and evolved in contact with one another. Meanwhile, the peoples of the Americas had built empires, cultivated land, and written their own histories apart from the rest of the world. The Atlantic Ocean was not yet a bridge. It was a border. But Columbus's landing began the process of tearing down that border, and the results would be both revolutionary and catastrophic. One of the most immediate consequences was the birth of the Columbian Exchange, a massive and ongoing transfer of people, plants, animals, diseases, and ideas between the old world and the new. This wasn't an organized policy. It wasn't planned, but it was inevitable once contact began. From Europe and Africa came wheat, sugarcane, horses, cattle, pigs, and chickens. From the Americas came maize, potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco, cacao, and countless other crops that would transform global diets and economies. But the exchange was not balanced. Along with livestock and crops, Europeans also brought diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, and others, that the native populations of the Americas had never encountered. With no immunity, entire communities were decimated. Some estimates suggest that within a century of Columbus's landing, 90% of the indigenous population in the Americas had perished due to disease, famine, displacement, and violence. It was the largest demographic collapse in human history, a genocide by contagion. At the same time, Europe began to realign its economy around its new colonies. Gold and silver extracted from the Americas, especially from future conquests in Central and South America, flooded into Spanish and Portuguese treasuries. These precious metals fueled the rise of capitalism, bankrolled European wars, and inflated global markets. Colonization didn't just bring new territory. It brought wealth on a scale that Europe had never known, and it changed the meaning of power itself. But it wasn't only goods and gold that crossed the Atlantic. People did too, and not all of them by choice. Within a few decades of Columbus's first voyage, the transatlantic slave trade began. As indigenous populations declined from disease and brutality, European colonizers turned to Africa to meet their growing demand for labor. Millions of Africans were kidnapped, sold, and shipped across the ocean in horrific conditions to work on plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas. The system of slavery that followed became the backbone of colonial wealth and a defining feature of the New World Order. Columbus didn't invent slavery or empire, but his voyage connected the dots between exploration, resource extraction, and human exploitation in ways that shaped the next 400 years. European powers, not just Spain and Portugal, but eventually France, England, and the Netherlands, joined the race for colonies. The Americas became a canvas for competing empires, each carving up land, enslaving people, and extracting resources to fuel their ambitions back home. Culturally, the impact was just as profound. The spread of Christianity became a global campaign. Missionaries arrived by the hundreds, determined to convert indigenous peoples and reframe their identities in the image of Europe. Languages, customs, names, and religions were erased or violently suppressed. Entire belief systems were outlawed. Sacred texts were burned. The cultural genocide that began with Columbus's landing didn't happen all at once. It unfolded slowly, systematically, and often under the guise of salvation. At the same time, new hybrid cultures began to form. European, African, and indigenous elements blended in complex and often painful ways. New languages emerged. New religions took shape. New forms of resistance were born, from slave revolts to indigenous uprisings to intellectual challenges to colonial rule. Out of the destruction, new identities formed: Creole, Mestizo, Mulatto, Maroon, people caught between worlds, forging new ones from the wreckage. And all of it, the trade, the violence, the cultural upheaval, began with one day. One step onto a beach, one assumption that the land was empty, one belief that what was unknown could be claimed. Columbus didn't set out to change the world. He set out to reach Asia. But in missing his destination, he created a new one, not just geographically, but historically. His journey triggered a chain reaction that connected continents, crushed civilizations, and reshaped the planet. Today, we live in the shadow of that day. The modern world, global trade, migration, conflict, inequality was born in part from the encounter that took place in 1492. The flags may have changed, the empires may have fallen, but the systems that rose from Columbus's landing remain very much alive. In the next part, we'll return to the man himself, to Columbus in his later years as his legacy unraveled, his ambitions faltered, and the world he helped create turned against him. When Columbus returned from his second voyage, he expected gratitude, praise, and increased authority. He had crossed the ocean again, established a colony, and captured a powerful Taino chief. In his eyes, these were the achievements of a loyal servant of the crown, a man fulfilling a divine mission. But something had changed. The image of Columbus as a visionary hero was beginning to crack. Rumors, complaints, and contradictions about his leadership filtered back to Spain. And for the first time, the crown began to ask not only what he had discovered, but how he was managing what he had found. The problems were real. La Isabela, the colony Columbus built after the destruction of La Navidad, was failing. Disease spread quickly in the humid, unfamiliar climate. Food shortages plagued the settlers. Morale plummeted. Infighting broke out between different factions of colonists. Many of the men had come for wealth and glory, not hard labor, tropical illness, and endless frustration. Columbus responded with strict discipline, often harsh punishment, and increasingly authoritarian control. His rule became resented not only by the Taino, but by his own people. Worse still, the riches he had promised were nowhere in sight. Gold was scarce. Trade with the natives, once friendly, had devolved into forced tribute systems. Columbus implemented quotas, demanding each adult Taino deliver a specific amount of gold every few months. Those who failed faced brutal punishments, including mutilation. In regions without gold, he demanded cotton or other goods instead. The system was exploitative, violent, and unsustainable. Entire communities were uprooted. The population, already weakened by disease, began to collapse under the weight of forced labor. Reports of these abuses and Columbus's harsh treatment of both natives and Spaniards eventually made their way back to Spain. Priests, soldiers, and even noblemen began to send letters to the crown, warning that Columbus was not the noble governor he claimed to be. They described cruelty, mismanagement, corruption. And while the Spanish monarchy still valued what Columbus had started, they began to question whether he was fit to lead what was quickly becoming a full-scale empire. Columbus, unaware of the full extent of his growing opposition, launched a third voyage in 1498. This time, he explored the northern coast of South America, discovering the Orinoco River and realizing, perhaps for the first time, that he was not near Asia at all. Still, he refused to abandon his narrative. He insisted he had reached the edge of paradise, the mouth of the biblical Garden of Eden. It was a theological pivot, not a geographic correction. He still could not admit that he had found a new continent. Back in Hispaniola, things deteriorated further. The colony was now split between supporters of Columbus and those who demanded his removal. A royal investigator, Francisco de Bobadilla, was sent to assess the situation. What he found shocked him. He arrested Columbus and his brothers, accused them of tyranny, and sent them back to Spain in chains. Yes, the man once paraded through royal courts as the discoverer of a new world was now returned to Europe as a prisoner. To Columbus's credit, he never stopped believing in his mission. When he stood before Ferdinand and Isabella, shackled and disgraced, he didn't apologize. He pleaded. He justified. He insisted that everything he had done was for God and crown. The monarchs, caught between loyalty and political pressure, eventually released him. His titles and some honors were restored, but his authority was not. He would never again govern the colonies. That era was over. Still, Columbus secured a fourth and final voyage in 1502, not as a ruler, but as an explorer. He was told to avoid Hispaniola and seek out new opportunities. On this voyage, he faced shipwreck, starvation, mutiny, and near death. He reached the coasts of Central America, but the mission was a failure. No new colonies. No new wealth. No redemption. He returned to Spain in 1504, sick, weakened, and ignored. Queen Isabella, his greatest patron, died shortly after. Columbus spent his final years in legal battles trying to reclaim the wealth and privileges he believed were owed to him under the original agreements. He argued that his discoveries had opened a new world and that he deserved the rewards promised. But the world had moved on. He died in 1506, largely forgotten by the court, his power stripped, his dream reduced to paperwork and bitterness. And yet, history had other plans. Over the next centuries, Columbus's name would be resurrected, repurposed, and mythologized. Statues would be built. Poems would be written. Cities and even an entire country, Colombia, would be named in his honor. In some tellings, he was the visionary who connected continents. In others, the brutal colonizer who opened the door to genocide. The truth, as always, lives somewhere in between. He was neither saint nor demon, but something more complicated. A man of his time, shaped by its faith and ambition, blind to what he had set in motion, yet essential to understanding how the modern world began. In the next part, we'll begin tying the threads together, reflecting on how the first day of Columbus's landing echoes into our present, and why it continues to spark debate, celebration, and resistance more than 500 years later. More than 5 centuries after Christopher Columbus set foot on a Caribbean island and claimed it for Spain, the world still argues about what that moment meant and what it should mean today. In classrooms, town halls, political speeches, and city streets, the question remains unresolved: was October 12, 1492, the beginning of progress or the start of catastrophe? A triumph of courage or a tragedy of conquest? A day to celebrate or a wound to remember? The debate surrounding Columbus isn't just about historical facts. It's about how we choose to interpret them, who gets to tell the story, and what values we project onto the past. For centuries, Columbus was held up as a symbol of exploration, ambition, and European ingenuity. In paintings and textbooks, he appeared noble and determined, the man who dared to sail west and opened the path to a new world. His voyages were described as the turning point between the medieval and modern eras. Monuments were erected, streets named, parades held. But as more voices entered the conversation, especially those of indigenous people and scholars from the global south, the picture began to change. The story that once glorified discovery was recast as one of destruction. The same journey that once inspired adventure was now viewed through the lens of colonization, slavery, and cultural erasure. Columbus was no longer seen by all as a hero. For many, he became a symbol of imperial violence, the man who brought genocide, not civilization. These competing narratives aren't simply historical disagreements. They reflect deeper cultural divides over identity, justice, and how nations remember their past. In the United States, this tension has played out most visibly in the debate over Columbus Day. Instituted as a federal holiday in 1937, it was originally intended to honor Italian-American heritage and celebrate the values of bravery and ambition. But in recent decades, it has come under increasing criticism. Activists, indigenous communities, and historians have pushed for its replacement with Indigenous Peoples Day, a day not to celebrate European arrival but to honor the cultures, histories, and resistance of native peoples who were displaced and destroyed in the wake of contact. Cities across the U.S. and countries across the Americas have begun to shift their public commemorations. Statues of Columbus have been taken down or vandalized. School curricula have been rewritten. The narrative is evolving. This evolution isn't about erasing history. It's about reframing it, acknowledging that multiple truths can exist side by side. Columbus's voyage was, without question, one of the most consequential events in human history. It connected continents, reshaped the globe, and launched the modern era. But that connection came at a cost paid in lives, languages, land, and memory. For the descendants of the Taino and other indigenous nations across the Americas, the legacy of that first day isn't something read in books, it's felt in lived experience. In the loss of ancestral territory. In the survival of traditions passed down in whispers. In the battle to preserve languages and cultural identity. For them, the arrival of Columbus marks not the beginning of history but a violent interruption. At the same time, the legacy of Columbus has become entangled with identity politics. For some immigrant communities, especially Italian Americans, the day still represents a rare recognition of their contributions to American society. For others, Columbus is a convenient villain, a historical scapegoat for centuries of European imperialism that extended far beyond one man's voyage. The result is a cultural tug-of-war over monuments, holidays, and historical memory. So how do we reconcile it? The answer may lie in accepting complexity. History is not a story of heroes or villains. It's a record of human action, driven by motives both noble and cruel, shaped by context, and interpreted differently across generations. Columbus was a man of his time, but his actions rippled far beyond it. He believed he was fulfilling a divine mission. He also initiated systems of slavery and exploitation. He opened the door to global exchange. He also opened the door to mass suffering. To ignore either side of that story is to flatten it into propaganda. Real history demands nuance. It demands that we hold two truths at once, that Columbus's arrival was both the beginning of the modern world and the beginning of enormous loss, that it launched centuries of innovation and centuries of oppression, that it cannot be undone but must be understood. Every October, the debate flares again. Should we teach children about the hero or the colonizer? Should we honor the journey or mourn the destruction? Should we remember him at all? Maybe the answer isn't in choosing one version over another. Maybe the answer is in choosing to confront it fully, honestly, and with humility. In the next part, we'll look at how Columbus's story has been told in art, literature, and film, and how those portrayals have influenced public understanding for better or worse. Over the centuries, Columbus has been painted, sculpted, fictionalized, glorified, criticized, and reinvented more times than almost any other historical figure. His image has been bent to fit the needs of artists, authors, empires, and ideologies across generations. The Columbus of history, a flawed, ambitious, often ruthless navigator, has been replaced over and over by the Columbus of myth, a fearless hero, a misunderstood visionary, or, more recently, an emblem of colonial cruelty. The way we remember Columbus today has less to do with what he actually did and more to do with how we've chosen to frame him in culture. One of the earliest examples of artistic reinterpretation comes from the Renaissance itself. In European paintings from the 16th and 17th centuries, Columbus is often depicted as a noble explorer clad in royal garments or armor, standing triumphantly over a map or pointing toward the horizon. In these images, he is not a sailor clinging to survival, but a man of destiny sent by divine will to unlock the secrets of the earth. These portrayals were meant to inspire and justify. They aligned with the colonial agenda of the time, validating empire building as a noble, godly endeavor. As time passed and the Enlightenment reshaped European values, Columbus was embraced by philosophers and political thinkers as a symbol of progress and discovery. In this retelling, he was less of a Christian warrior and more of a rational seeker, someone who defied superstition and expanded human knowledge. Writers used him as a metaphor for bold thought and defiance against ignorance. America, especially after its own revolution, latched onto this version eagerly. By the 19th century, Columbus had been adopted as a foundational figure in the American national story. His name was plastered onto cities, rivers, and the capital of the United States Federal District, Washington, D.C., formerly situated within the District of Columbia. He was hailed not as a Spaniard or an Italian, but as a universal symbol of New World ambition. Literature reinforced this. School textbooks, novels, and children's stories cast him as the noble underdog, mocked by flat earth believers, scorned by doubters, vindicated by the sea itself. Of course, much of this narrative was fiction. There's no evidence that anyone in Columbus's time seriously believed the earth was flat. His voyage was controversial not because of cosmology, but because of doubts about distances and provisioning. But these falsehoods served a purpose. They turned Columbus into a moral lesson. Be bold. Ignore critics. Trust yourself. The man became a myth, and the myth became national identity. In the 20th century, Hollywood joined the chorus. Films like Christopher Columbus, 1949, 1492, Conquest of Paradise, 1992, and others presented sweeping epics of discovery, complete with orchestral scores, exotic landscapes, and heroic dialogue. Columbus was played by charismatic actors, his flaws softened, his ambition romanticized. These movies didn't set out to deceive, but they prioritized drama over accuracy. They reinforced an image of first contact as a beautiful meeting of cultures, not the start of enslavement and resistance. Even in popular culture, Columbus was a fixture. Statues stood in town squares. His name marked parades, holidays, banks, universities. For Italian Americans, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Columbus became a point of pride, a way to assert belonging in a society that often treated them as outsiders. Columbus Day became not just a holiday but a cultural shield against discrimination. But as indigenous voices grew louder, especially in the wake of civil rights movements, academic shifts, and global decolonization, art began to change. Literature turned critical. Writers like Howard Zinn, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, and Eduardo Galeano exposed the violence behind the myth. Films like Even the Rain, 2010, examined the legacy of colonization from the perspective of resistance. Murals and public art projects began to reinterpret Columbus not as a bringer of light, but as the harbinger of darkness. And the statues began to fall. In recent years, monuments to Columbus have been defaced, removed, or taken down preemptively by cities across the Americas. To some, this is a necessary reckoning. To others, an attack on heritage. But what's undeniable is that the symbol no longer means the same thing to everyone. For many, he represents not just a man, but a system, one that valued land over life, conquest over culture, and exploitation over coexistence. This shift in art and narrative isn't about rewriting history. It's about re-examining it. Just as previous generations sculpted Columbus in marble to project empire, today's artists deconstruct him to challenge empire. Both are acts of cultural interpretation. And both speak to the immense weight that one man's story continues to carry. Columbus is no longer just a historical figure. He's a mirror. What we see in him says as much about us as it does about him. And as we continue to write, paint, film, and argue about his legacy, we're also shaping the legacy of our own time, deciding what stories we preserve, what truths we honor, and what myths we're finally ready to let go. In the next part, we'll turn to the legacy left on the lands themselves, from the irreversible transformation of ecosystems to the rebuilding of identity by the descendants of those first colonized. When Columbus first stepped onto an island in the Caribbean, he described the land as paradise. He marveled at the lush vegetation, the clear rivers, the birdsong, and the bounty of fruit. Seemed untouched, abundant, eternal. But within just a few decades, that paradise began to change, and not through natural evolution. The encounter between two worlds did not only disrupt human societies. It also transformed the land itself, often violently and permanently. The environmental impact of colonization began almost immediately. European settlers brought with them crops and animals that had never existed in the Americas. Wheat, sugarcane, coffee, pigs, cattle, goats, horses. These were not minor additions. They were engines of ecological disruption. European farming practices cleared vast stretches of land for monoculture plantations. Forests were felled. Wetlands were drained. Grasslands were overgrazed. Erosion followed. Fertile land became depleted under relentless cycles of European-style agriculture. Sugarcane, in particular, became a crop of empire. It grew well in the Caribbean climate and generated enormous profit, but it demanded massive labor and land. Entire islands were converted into sugar economies, displacing native crops and food systems. This agricultural transformation not only restructured ecosystems but also restructured societies. Indigenous farming techniques and seasonal cycles were replaced with plantation schedules driven by global markets. The introduction of European animals was equally disruptive. Pigs and goats, left to roam freely, destroyed native plants and disturbed the natural balance of local habitats. Horses, while transformative for transport and warfare, also required large tracts of grazing land. The very fabric of the landscape was altered to fit European needs and imaginations, to serve colonial ambitions rather than ecological sustainability. But environmental change was only part of the upheaval. Equally deep were the cultural scars. For the Taino, the first people to greet Columbus, the transformation was swift and devastating. Their numbers, which may have exceeded 1 million across the Greater Antilles in 1492, collapsed within decades. Disease took the heaviest toll, but it was compounded by forced labor, warfare, and the psychological trauma of cultural erasure. The Spanish imposed a new social order, the encomienda system. In theory, it was a system of protection and Christian education in exchange for labor. In practice, it was a form of slavery. Taino communities were broken apart. Chiefs were deposed. Ceremonial centers were destroyed. Entire languages vanished. Names were changed. Children were baptized with Christian names and raised in European households. Yet even in the face of this devastation, culture did not disappear. It adapted. It resisted. It survived underground, in hidden rituals, whispered stories, and encoded songs. Taino words like canoe, hammock, and barbecue entered European languages, proof that some elements of native life penetrated the dominant culture. Spiritual practices fused with Catholicism in complex ways. Herbal medicine continued in the shadows. And in recent decades, descendants of the Taino and other indigenous peoples have worked tirelessly to reclaim their identity, asserting that they were never fully gone, only silenced. The environmental and cultural changes that began with Columbus were not isolated to the Caribbean. As colonization spread to the mainland, to Mexico, Peru, Brazil, North America, the same patterns repeated. Native lands were seized. Forests were cut. Rivers were diverted. Sacred spaces were desecrated. The land became a commodity, and its original stewards were either pushed to the margins or eliminated entirely. This transformation is still visible today. Many of the world's poorest regions are rich in natural resources, a legacy of extractive colonial economies that exploited land without investing in long-term well-being. Patterns of inequality, land ownership, and ecological vulnerability often trace back directly to the era that began in 1492. But the story is not only one of loss. Across the Americas, indigenous movements are rising. From the Amazon to the Arctic, native communities are fighting to protect their land, preserve their languages, and reassert their sovereignty. They are not relics of the past, they are leaders of the present, drawing on ancestral knowledge to challenge climate destruction, corporate exploitation, and political marginalization. In some Caribbean nations, indigenous heritage is being re-examined and celebrated, not denied. Cultural festivals honor ancient rhythms. Schools teach pre-Columbian history. DNA studies reveal that many Caribbean people, long thought to be disconnected from their indigenous roots, still carry Taino ancestry. The colonial narrative that declared them extinct is being rewritten by the living. So while the land bears scars and the culture bears wounds, neither is dead. The first day of Columbus's arrival set off waves of irreversible change, but it did not erase the past. It transformed it. And in that transformation, new identities were born, shaped by survival, memory, and resistance. In the next part, we'll explore the global legacy of Columbus through modern geopolitics, how the structure of the world's nations, borders, and inequalities still reflects the chain of events that began with his first landfall. The moment Columbus landed in the Caribbean, he unknowingly triggered a geopolitical chain reaction that would rewire the structure of the world. It didn't happen overnight, but from that day forward, power, wealth, and territory would be reorganized around the consequences of European expansion. The resulting systems of conquest, colonization, trade, and exploitation created deep global inequalities that still define the modern age. One of the first and most consequential shifts came in 1494, just 2 years after Columbus's first voyage, with the signing of the Treaty of Tordesillas. Brokered by the Pope, the treaty drew an imaginary line through the Atlantic Ocean, giving Spain the rights to any lands west of it and Portugal the rights to lands east. This arbitrary line divided the non-European world between two colonial superpowers as if the rest of the world's people, cultures, and governments didn't matter. No input was asked from indigenous nations, African kingdoms, or Asian empires. The world was being carved up on European terms. This kind of thinking that distant lands were there to be claimed, divided, and ruled laid the foundation for colonialism as a system. Over the next 4 centuries, European powers seized territories across the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. They extracted wealth, imposed foreign governance, and reorganized societies to serve external interests. And it all began with Columbus, not because he invented empire, but because he expanded its scope to a global scale. The Americas were transformed into supply zones for European markets. Sugar, silver, tobacco, coffee, and later cotton became the engines of colonial economies. These crops required massive amounts of labor, leading directly to the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade, one of the darkest legacies of the Columbian era. Over 12 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands and shipped across the ocean to fuel European wealth. The racial hierarchies and systemic injustices rooted in that trade still reverberate today. The labor, land, and lives of non-European peoples became the raw material of European development. Nations like Spain, Portugal, France, England, and the Netherlands used colonial profits to fund industrialization, build armies, and consolidate political power. Meanwhile, colonized regions were intentionally kept dependent, their infrastructure underdeveloped, their education systems Eurocentric, their economies tied to foreign demands. Columbus's landing was the starting point for this asymmetry. His voyage helped create a world where global inequality was not a byproduct of development, but a strategy embedded in how development happened. Wealth flowed from periphery to core, from colony to empire, from south to north. And the social orders that emerged from this flow, class, race, caste, were designed to preserve that imbalance. Even after colonies gained independence, the structures remained. Borders drawn by empires created artificial nations with deep internal divisions. Resource wealth continued to benefit foreign companies. Debt, dependency, and military intervention replaced overt rule. The global map today, with its sharp contrasts between rich and poor, powerful and powerless, is still shaped by the consequences of 1492. Culturally, Columbus's arrival helped establish the idea of European cultural superiority. Western knowledge, language, religion, and governance were exported as universal standards, while indigenous and non-Western systems were dismissed, suppressed, or destroyed. This mindset still echoes in global politics, international aid, and even environmental policy, where solutions are often imposed from above rather than developed from within. It's easy to view Columbus as a distant figure, a sailor, a navigator, a man with a dream. But the world we live in is not separate from his journey. It is a direct outcome of it. The ports that dominate trade today, the currencies that drive global finance, the languages spoken in vast swaths of the world all bear the marks of colonial expansion that began with his first landing. That doesn't mean Columbus is responsible for every injustice. But it does mean that his voyage cannot be seen in isolation. It was the match that lit a fire. And that fire burned across continents, reshaping human lives, landscapes, and systems of power. Today, debates about wealth distribution, reparations, immigration, and cultural identity are often framed as contemporary issues. But they're not new. They're the long tale of empire of a world divided centuries ago on a beach in the Caribbean by a man who thought he had reached Asia. In the final part, we'll reflect on why that first day still matters, how remembering it truthfully can help us understand not just the past, but how to build a more just future. October 12, 1492. A single step onto an unfamiliar beach by a man who thought he'd reached the edge of Asia. That moment, small, quiet, unnoticed by the world at the time, became one of the most significant turning points in human history. Everything that followed, from vast empires to silent extinctions, from scientific revolutions to systems of oppression, began on that first day. But the question we're left with more than 5 centuries later isn't just what happened. It's what do we do with it now? The legacy of Columbus is not a static story etched in stone. It's a living conversation, one that we revisit and revise with each new generation. That first day still matters because it didn't just change maps. It changed the trajectory of human society. It created connections that were unimaginable. But it also introduced systems of domination and extraction that we still grapple with. To understand Columbus's legacy means confronting uncomfortable truths. It means acknowledging that the so-called discovery of the Americas was also the beginning of displacement, disease, forced labor, and cultural destruction for millions of indigenous people. It means realizing that globalization, for all its technological and economic benefits, was born in blood and smoke. The world we live in was not built equally, and it didn't become unequal by accident. At the same time, understanding that history does not mean succumbing to guilt or paralysis. It means embracing the responsibility to see clearly, to listen to voices that have been silenced, to recognize the full cost of progress, and to rethink the myths we've inherited. Reassessing Columbus isn't about erasing him. It's about putting him in the proper context. Seeing him as a complex man, ambitious, flawed, deeply human, whose actions triggered a chain of events larger than himself. That first day still matters because the narratives we tell about it shape how we view ourselves and others. If we continue to teach children that Columbus discovered an empty land, we erase the histories of the peoples who already lived there. If we present him only as a villain, we miss the broader systems that used his voyage to justify centuries of exploitation. Nuance matters. Precision matters. Honesty matters. And so does justice. For many indigenous peoples, that first day is not a holiday. It's a day of mourning. A reminder of all that was lost, languages, lands, lives, and possibilities. But it can also be a day of resilience. The fact that indigenous cultures continue to exist, to resist, to create is itself a profound rejection of the narrative that began with Columbus's arrival. It's proof that the future does not belong solely to the victors of the past. That day also holds meaning for descendants of Africans brought to the Americas in chains. For them, it marks the start of the world that made the transatlantic slave trade possible and the enduring fight for dignity and freedom that followed. And for immigrants, settlers, and others who came long after, it raises questions about what it means to live on land shaped by conquest and what responsibility comes with that inheritance. Columbus's voyage was not the beginning of history. It was the meeting of histories. And from that meeting came both destruction and creation, horror and hope. The challenge today is to hold both realities at once, to remember the dead and honor the survivors, to tell the truth and imagine something better. Because the story of that first day isn't over. We are still living in its aftermath, but we're also shaping its legacy. With every decision about education, commemoration, justice, and policy, we're deciding what that day will mean for the next generation. So perhaps the real question isn't whether to celebrate or condemn Columbus. It's how to use the truth of what happened to build a more honest, inclusive, and equitable world. A world where discovery no longer means domination. A world where history isn't just inherited, it's owned, understood, and reshaped. And that's why the first day still matters. If this story gave you new insight, if it challenged what you thought you knew, or made you see history in a deeper way, consider subscribing to the channel. We dive into stories like this to uncover the layers beneath the surface, to bring you history that isn't just informative, but transformative. Hit the like button if you found this episode valuable, and leave a comment with your thoughts. What should we explore next?